We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker, your host for Mostly Economics. Thanks for joining us. We have with us today Arindrajit Dube, who's Provost Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, and also the author of the recent book, The Wage Standard, which I encourage people to look at. And it's not overly technical. It has the technical stuff for those who want to see it, but it basically tells you the story of how we could have living wages, better wages for most workers. So thanks for joining us, Arindrajit.
It's great to be here. Thanks for hosting me.
So I just want to say, I've known you, I don't know, probably about 25 years. I think when I first met you were involved in living wage campaigns at Harvard, where you were a grad student and you were trying to get decent pay for the custodial staff, the cafeteria workers, and you had some success with that. But, it was great to see. I mean, not to diminish it, but we're going, well, that's good, university workers, and, they should be treated fairly. But that's in kind of small bore. And, today we're looking at, minimum wages having risen in, many states around the country. We haven't raised the federal minimum wage in, 18 years now, but 17
Right.
years. But things have really changed. And, you've been at the center of that. And, just to throw one more factoid in there, I think this is before you were involved. If you go back to the 80s, this is when I was in grad school, the New York Times had an editorial, I'm sure you've seen it, where it said the optimum minimum wage, 0. And
That's right.
This is the New York Times. So things have changed.
Yeah. Interestingly, so the book is dedicated to Frank Morley. Frank was a janitor at Harvard, and he was actually the person who cleaned the economics department. And I met him when I was visiting Harvard. My degree's from University of Chicago, but I spent a good amount of time at Harvard working with Richard Freeman, and that's when I met Frank. And in many ways, that experience, seeing that people are getting paid different wages depending on if they're outsourced or in-house within the same company, Harvard, right? A lower wage if you're not a unionized worker, in-house worker. And then after all said and done, with a lot of protests and push, that, several thousand Harvard workers were able to get a very substantial raise, and raising wages for outsourced janitors like Frank, so that it was tied to the unionized internal wage scale. And so seeing that really had a profound impact in many ways. That's a through line in my book, because it sort of suggests that, wages aren't just determined by supply and demand. Yeah, supply and demand matter, but so do other things. And it's also in partly our control. And so, yes, seeing how some things have changed and how things can change is definitely an important part of the book.
Yeah, no, that's a huge deal. And it's, again, going back a little further in history, I mean, I don't, you probably know this better than I do, but, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, so the classic era where, we did see, strong productivity growth and broadly shared wage gains, so we had, great productivity growth those decades, and workers were getting their share of it. And at that time, outsourcing like that, I'm not going to say it didn't happen, but I think it was pretty rare. So, you had big companies, General Motors being the classic, and obviously the UAW workers were doing well, but even the custodians working for General Motors got pretty good pay. So, for custodians, I'll say they weren't doing great, but, but sure, they were benefiting in that sense. And that really starts to change, I'd say, in the 70s and much more so in the 80s, where you had, outsourcing became a common practice. So, as you say, at Harvard, I didn't know the specifics at Harvard. You obviously know that much, much better, but, you could have staff that were employed directly by the university that were getting paid considerably more than those that they contracted with.
That's right. And this would sort of like is one of the things I say in the book, that the idea that wages are not just pinned down by your skills, that idea has been around actually for quite a bit of time. Mid 20th century, we had institutional minded or institutionalist labor economists who went and surveyed companies and saying, look, the same occupation pays different wages, but it didn't fully convince people because, well, maybe there are other things that are different between workers, et cetera. But this is where, when you're at, when I was a grad student, seeing like, these are two exactly the same jobs in the same company, in the same building, but people are getting paid differently. So that's got to really matter. And so this was one of the interesting things, that when you actually start seeing like, well, look, pay is not just pinned down by these forces like supply and demand surely matter, but so do our choices. And then that becomes like, well, what choices are we making? Because you're absolutely right, starting in the 80s, I think we started making different choices. And one of those, of course, was the choice to not raise the federal minimum wage. That was really the first time that we didn't actually raise the minimum wage for a long period, and it was near about almost 10 years. And now we have gone for over a generation without raising the federal minimum wage. And so that, I think, was, one of many choices that really, I think, had an impact on that sort of, untethering of wages of so many workers to the economy-wide productivity that we sort of started seeing in the 1980s. And, that's sort of the starting point. And, it's a story that has been told by others, but, it's something that I recount, and then I sort of try to help understand and make sense of that based on what we have seen in research. And then also, and then this is the part of the book, this is not just a doom and gloom book, because we've also seen how we can do better. And that's an important thing. The Harvard example is a microcosm of how we can do better, but we have seen various ways, be it state level policies, or in the more recent periods of, tight labor markets, these can change things around. And, none of them have changed everything around, or nearly so, but it has given us examples, and it's given us evidence that I sort of recount in the book.
I'm drawing a blank on this. I got to ask you, who is you I'm sure had him as a professor, at least ran across him at the University of Chicago, the guy who did the stuff, a Nobel Prize winner, unobserved characteristics. I'm trying to, saying that there wasn't actually discrimination, because you could run a regression, women get paid less than men, blacks get paid less than whites. And he said, well, that's because they were unobserved. And he had
so I think that there's more broadly, that has been a argument that I think a lot of economists have made. And of course, University of Chicago clearly believing in sort of the well-functioning markets, that argument has had greater purchase
guy?
there.
I can't think of his name for some reason. Him.
Well, I don't know if you think Kevin Murphy.
No. He's older than he'd be well into his 80s now. Probably he's an older guy. Got Nobel Prize. Okay, it's not important. I'm just pissed at myself because I can't remember. I've met him. You've met him. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. But anyhow, just one more thing I want to say on the minimum wage, because again, I've said this. I'm sure you've said 1,000 times to people that the minimum wage, the national minimum wage, had risen in step with productivity, economy-wide productivity, from when it was first put in place in 38 until 68. And if that continued to be the case, because we've often talked about, setting the same level, adjusting for inflation, I don't know where we'd be today, 14, 15 or whatever. But, if it had kept step with productivity as it did for, those 3 decades, and we had low unemployment, late 60s, it would be around 25, 26 an hour. I haven't looked lately.
That's right. Like that. Yeah. If we had tied to overall productivity, it'd be like around 25, I believe, dollars an hour. If we had tied it to the median wage, it would be more like maybe $18 an hour. If you had just tied it to price, it'd be 14 or so. So I think all of those, none of those are true, of course. And so instead we're at 725.
Yeah.
But, I think at the same time, what we have been doing is over the last 12 years, we've been running a unprecedented natural experiment. And that natural experiment is that we have 30 states and Washington, D.C. that have raised their wages. And some of them substantially so, especially after the so-called Fight for 15 movement, I think gave more encouragement to really push for more ambitious minimum wage policies. And then we have 20 states where it's 725. Now, to be clear, 725 is not really a active minimum wage pretty much anywhere. So in a practical sense, we have about 20 states in the country for the first time since the 1930s that basically doesn't have a minimum wage. So this is sort of a very stark, this sort of stark difference, I think, is really kind of clarified. Well, what exactly is it doing? Because you can actually look to see, let's compare these 30 states versus 20 states
Just
that
to
are.
clarify, for some people might not understand what you meant by saying it doesn't have an active. No one actually gets paid $7.25 an hour. So you have a
No,
minimum
exactly. So just
7.25, but even the lowest paid workers probably get 8 or 9 or whatever.
that's right, especially with rising inflation and higher wage growth in the last 5-6 years.
Yeah.
At this point, 725 is just not a binding minimum wage, even in those 20 states for most part, where that's the only minimum there is.
Yeah. So we have 20 states that have raised their, is it 20? How many, I'm sorry, you just said how many have raised their wages?
Yeah, 30 states and DC have
Okay,
raised their,
raised
let's
their
say
minimum
30
wage.
states.
And
Yeah.
the 20 that don't. And of course, many cities, New York City, Seattle, San Francisco, have higher than statewide minimum.
Right.
And also, again, recounting some ancient history. I remember when, there were sort of the first efforts in this direction back in the 90s. It was at the city level. And no, I guess state level, New Jersey was, and,
That's right.
many of us, you're probably in this camp that, we thought, okay, good, but you have to be very cautious thinking that, okay, maybe, raise it by 10% or something, 15%, but that, if you did it to any substantial extent, you'd lose all the jobs, something like that. I mean, I don't know if anyone literally thought that, but there would be repercussions that none of us would want. And
that's right. And I think that was essentially the state of play, I think, in around then. So maybe, of course, taking that to the extreme was the mid 80s a New York Times editorial saying the minimum wage should be zero. But even if you didn't believe it should be zero, you thought almost certainly it costs some jobs. Maybe it's not. Maybe it doesn't cost too many jobs, and so if it's not too high, but the idea that the higher minimum wage would cost jobs was the dominant belief in the economics profession, as well as I think many policymakers. And so what happened was sort of ironically, because of the dysfunctional way we were setting minimum wages, where the federal minimum wage didn't rise at all, you had states first step in and raise their minimum. For example, California raised its minimum wage in the late 1980s, and then New Jersey raised its minimum wage in 1992. And what happened is that became what economists now call natural experiments. It's like it's as if it's a lab and you give one group some medicine treatment and the other is your control group. You don't. Well, of course, you can't do that in real life in a lab setting for most part for minimum wages. But in this case, it's sort of like, well, New Jersey raised its minimum wage. And hey, look, right next door is Pennsylvania. They did not. And so this was a famous study by David Card and Alan Kruger, who said, you know what, why don't we actually just go survey some fast food restaurants and let's do it before and see how many jobs there were and what they were paying. And let's go back and do it afterwards. And we'll do that in New Jersey. And hey, look, here's Eastern Pennsylvania. That's right there. It's pretty similar looking. And why don't we just do it there too? And then we'll just compare. And that's what they did. And what they found was really kind of shook things up in the economics profession, and I think also in the policy circle. And because what they found, of course, in that now very well-known study is that jobs didn't actually fall in New Jersey from this around 20% or so increase in the minimum wage. And that was just very surprising. People were like, well, some people didn't believe it. Some people argued that it was bad data, that they were being.
Yeah, let me just emphasize, it was really hostile, the reaction.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember, I'm forgetting everyone's name these days, but there was a very prominent economist who said this was woke. He didn't use that term woke, but whatever was the equivalent at the time.
I mean, there were some pretty harsh words said that, Buchanan, who was become a Nobel laureate, wrote an op-ed saying, unless economists were to become a something about like a bevy of prostitutes, let's say, we can't possibly believe this. Other people saying this is basically like saying this is going against the law of gravity in physics.
Yeah.
And so, so I think that generally what happened is then there was a strong pushback. And then they went back, and instead of doing their own survey, they were able to get administrative data representing nearly all fast food workers in those two states, and showing that it actually held up over the course of the entire 90s. And so that, I think, also really helped clarify that this was something real. At the same time, this was a single experiment. And, in many ways, my own work with Michael Reich and Bill Lester built on this, could be summarized maybe by the word many. Like, we did many of these instead of just doing one. Said, hey, why don't we take a lot longer period, like 16 years, and take all these different changes, and then we use data that wasn't actually available to them at the time, that publicly available data from those administrative counts by each county. So we can compare counties across the state borders, similar to what they're doing, but even more sort of fine-grained, but doing it for a lot larger set of these experiments, if you will. And what we found was very consistent with their findings, but their original paper as well as their follow-up paper, showing that, in fact, you could look 4 or 5 years after the policy passed, and you can compare the two sides of the border. And yes, the one side that raised its wage saw average wage in the fast food or restaurant sector more broadly rise very clearly and persistently. At the same time, you track employment, and over 5 years, the employment didn't grow differentially in those two sides. And that gave us, I think, a lot of confidence that these policies were largely benefiting low-wage workers without causing the type of, job loss that I think a lot of people were afraid of.
When you said average wages, that's again a point, it's in your writing, and, others have, of course, emphasized this, the idea of a spillover effect. So we raise the bottom, $10 to $15, whatever, we wouldn't raise it that much, at least not in one fell swoop, but, whatever, you raise the bottom. But the workers that were, say getting 15, 50, 16 before, they get bumped up too. So
That's right.
Extremely important spillover effect.
Yeah. So, if most of the time when the minimum wage rises, maybe 10% of the workforce are directly affected by the increase. I mean, of course, it depends on how large, but historically, based on actual minimum wage increases, but the ripple effect or the spillover effect actually extends to maybe 25 or the 30th percentile of the pay distribution. In other words, about a third of the workers easily are actually affected by the setting of the minimum wage, if not directly, then indirectly. And that's an important part of why, when the minimum wage was not raised for so long, and as it has not been raised for so long now, it really shapes inequality, wage inequality, not just in a very mechanical way at the very bottom, but really the kind of the bottom third of the distribution is really strongly impacted by these policies.
Yeah, and that's, again, goes against, if I'll be crude, the neoclassical theory where kind of we have every worker's out there, they're getting paid their marginal product. So you have this person
That's
over
right.
here, they're worth 12 an hour. That person's worth 14. This person's worth 16, whatever. And that's all based on their own product. Whereas, your work and others have shown that, no, you have, there's social relations here. So if the person sitting next to you is getting 14 an hour, you've been there 2 years longer, you have a more, you expect 17, so it's these are relative. It's not
Exactly. Yeah. And those social relations really are an important driver of this, because you can actually see this interestingly. Imagine the minimum wage goes up to $15 an hour. Now, if you're a $16 an hour worker and there are a lot of people below you in the same company that just got a raise, pretty much you are going to get a raise too. But if you're a $16 worker, but there's no one working like lower than $15 in your company, you're much less likely to get a raise. And that's exactly the kind of evidence that you can marshal to show those social relations play an important role in transmitting that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's kind of lost in economics that this was the institutional labor economics of the 50s and 60s that basically
That's
got
right.
blown out of the water somewhere in the 70s and 80s. And of course, you got brought back, which is great.
Yeah, and so what's real sort of the story I try to tell in the book is that that history and trajectory that you had people out there, economists who were like John Dunlop and others who really trying to establish like how realistic pay setting worked, and then a lot of that got really lost until at least one of the reasons I think that, or things that helped bring it back, was better data. Because with better data, it became harder and harder to argue that it was things like stuff that you didn't see, unobserved skills, etc. So, for example, matched employer-employee data, where you can actually track workers going from job to job, you can then look to see what happens when you go from a low-paid company, let's say Walmart, which is not a particularly high-paying retailer, to a better paying retailer like Costco. Now, if the same worker goes from Walmart to Costco and earns a different amount, that becomes much harder to sort of argue it's because of the person's skill sort of overnight, grew. So instead, it becomes a wage strategy, a pay policy that different companies actually pursue. So I think the increasing use of better data, I think, helped bring back some older ideas that actually were around, including about how minimum wages might impact the labor market.
When you mentioned Dunlop, I sort of smirked a little bit because he was actually, I mean, I never met him, but he was a very prominent economist, but he was a conservative. He was in the Nixon administration. So
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
not a left-wing view particularly. I mean, it was
No,
very
I
much.
think it was more, it's like a realistic view of how markets work. And you could be, like you could take a policy position that's not progressive and, but still actually have in my mind, a more accurate understanding of the labor market functioning. And I think instead we sort of went to more and more sort of, simplistic visions where pay setting was just this, market forces are just going to pin everything down. So then the only thing left are technology and skills. Again, two things that are surely important, but, the idea that other things don't matter can lead to a very incomplete and sometimes, incomplete theory with misleading, sort of implications of what policies would actually do.
The name I was thinking before, Heckman, you had to know
Oh,
Heckman.
sure. Okay.
So the Heckman correction, he was, you'd find these differences. They said it's all unobserved characteristics, but neither here nor there. Just one more thing on this before we go on to some other couple other topics. Just how much difference this has made in people's lives. So what's the minimum wage now in Seattle? Are we at like 20 an hour there?
It's a little under, but yeah, it's we have minimum wages that sort of range between roughly for most part between like $12 and $18 across different states today. One way to think about it, because sometimes dollar figures are a little hard to make sense of, like in terms of how binding it is. Sometimes we look at it as a ratio of the median wage, so the minimum to median wage ratio. And here, it's interesting if you look at kind of like our high income peer countries. Let's take the OECD countries. The average today is about 60%. So the minimum wage is about 60% of the median wage. Interestingly, that's a good amount higher than it was maybe 20 years ago. So across high income countries, and there's actually been a sort of increasing use of more ambitious minimum wages. To take one example, the United Kingdom has a minimum wage about 2/3 of the median wage. That's one of the higher ones, or New Zealand even higher, and so forth. In the United States, if you look at states that are that have sort of high minimum wages, Arizona actually has about close to about 60% of the median wage, and California is pretty high. Maine is pretty high. Massachusetts has a $15 minimum wage, but Massachusetts is a very high wage state, so it actually is relatively low as a share of the median wage, and that matters because it means probably not that many people are affected by it. But overall, we do have this big divide because, there are like examples I gave, like Arizona, but also other states like Nebraska. These are, by the way, more conservative leaning states. Why do they have a minimum wage? Well, because it's a very popular policy amongst voters. If it's actually put to a ballot initiative, it almost always tends to pass. And so that's why you have Nebraska, Missouri, Arizona, Florida. These are sort of red or
Didn't
purple
Arkansas
states.
pass one too?
What's that?
Didn't Arkansas pass one too?
Arkansas is another, absolutely. Alaska is another one. And some of these some of these are actually relatively high and binding compared to their median wages. I actually recently wrote a blog post sort of following up saying, hey, let's take these 5 states that are all red and purple states. What happened to their restaurant wages? What happened to their restaurant employment or their low wage sector more broadly, employment and wages over the last 15 years? Because you can just look at those and let's take the other 20 states that didn't do anything. This is not a very complicated, sophisticated statistical analysis. It's just taking means and plotting it. And it's just very clear. It's like, oh, there's the wage. It goes up. Here's the employment. Oh, nothing happens. Nothing happens. And you just keep going until 2025. And that's basically the evidence. The evidence is really straightforward and clear if you're willing to look. Not everyone's willing to look or acknowledge it, but when you do, it's just like, well, we have ran this really, it's a terrible way to set policy, but it's a very, very powerful natural experiment where you've gone and now, for 17 years without raising the federal minimum wage, and over 12 years of that, we've seen states increasingly raise their minimum wage and creating this big gulf between those two groups of states. And the gulf shows up in pay for especially, be it restaurants or retail and other low wage sectors. But when it comes to the employment trajectories, they're actually virtually the same across these two groups of states. And that just becomes really hard to argue against, that something else is going on that would actually explain that basic fact.
Yeah. No, the evidence here, at this point, you're more involved in the debate, but at this point, I don't know how serious economists can argue on the other side. It's, say, just clear, I'm sure someone somewhere has lost the job because of the higher minimum wage. That's almost guaranteed to be true. But the question is, people are always losing jobs. So that's unfortunate. I don't want to minimize that. But, if we could make, 10 million workers better off with a higher wage and, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, I'm sorry for those workers, but, it's hard to see that as not being a net gain.
Right. And it's not even that somehow, let's say that there was a small but clear reduction in jobs. It's not that, those 1,000 workers are just forever not going to have a job. It's just rather that maybe they spend a few more days between jobs, or maybe a week even, let's say. But when they have a job, it pays more. So it becomes really, low wage workers as a whole, even if there's some reduced jobs, can easily be much better off. And that's another thing that sometimes gets lost, is that, we have a pretty clear, there's a lot of turnover in these labor markets.
That's a hugely important point, I think, underappreciated, and including by people who should know better, that, we have 5 to 6 million people who lose or leave their job every month. And obviously disproportionately things like restaurants, custodians, so these people are changing jobs frequently, sometimes by choice, sometimes not. And, again, no one wants to see these people out of work, but it's not like they're put over in the corner and never going to get a job again.
That's right. Interestingly, of course, one thing that happens when you raise the minimum wage is that turnover does fall. And that also is a very useful thing to recognize, because it happens because these are now better jobs. And so you actually see less people moving across jobs and staying there longer, which is in fact one of the reasons why sometimes the, profits are not even affected that negatively as you may think it would. And one of the reasons is because, there's some productivity offsets. Not to say that it pays for itself, but just saying but it means that part of it pays some of it by, by itself using productivity gains. And there's really good evidence on both turnover as well as when you look directly at productivity at major retailers, for instance. There's definitely clear offsets that occur. Both when the minimum wage rises, also when individual companies have chosen to pay a higher wage, that has definitely led to offsetting productivity gains. In one case that I talk about in the book, there's a study that shows this major logistics company actually instituted a voluntary minimum wage, which is an interesting thing in its own right. And it actually paid for itself through productivity gains. I don't take that to be the representative case, but this company was paying so much lower that it actually paid for itself. But in other cases, I think it has led to substantial offsets as well. But yes, I think that these other channels become really important to understand, and they're just not there in this very simple sort of supply and demand framework.
Yeah, no, it's very important. So I want to change course a little bit because you wrote some very important work with Annie McGrew and David Otter about how the low unemployment of the Biden years, and plenty of people have trashed Biden. I've done that so myself, but we did get the unemployment rate down very quickly, and it's easy to forget. I mean, he came in 2021, January 2021. We were still very far from recovered from the pandemic, so we still had unemployment. I forget, we're well over 6%. We still were down somewhere around 8 million jobs from the pre-pandemic level. So we had a long way to go with the recovery. And he had his, of course, very aggressive recovery package. And we could argue whether it was too aggressive. I mean, again, reasonable points. But the point was it did quickly get people back to work. And we got the unemployment rate down very quickly. We were under 4% by the end of the year, end of 2021. And we eventually got down to, I think it was 3.4% at the low point. A lot of people never thought that was possible. I remember arguing with a lot of people that we can't get below 5%, because we'd have runaway inflation. And, we had some inflation. How much of that was due to the low unemployment? Another question. But in any case, we got very low unemployment. And, your work showed that had a huge impact in reducing wage inequality.
Yeah. So, I'm going to actually sort of step back a little bit and sort of, when I first started writing, I started writing this book in 2021. It took a little while, but I was going to talk about the importance of full employment. Now, at that time, was going to, of course, also talk about your book, because you have been, of course, talking about this for a long time. So your work with, Jared Bernstein on full employment made this argument that it's in fact going to be compressive, and it leads to wage growth at the bottom and the middle. And, drawing on the experience also of the high pressure labor market in the 1990s, which was one of the few times that there was actually broad-based wage growth after 1980. So I was writing that, and so while I was writing the book on this topic, we had arguably the most sort of strongest, version of this really kind of occurred in real life. So this is one of the interesting things about the process of writing the book, is you actually saw things happening in real life that you were supposed to write about, and so I was like, well, let's study this, and that's what we did. And what we found is that between 2019 and 2024, about a third of the increase in wage inequality that had occurred after 1980, about a third of it got reversed in 5 years, basically. And that was really driven strongly by a tight labor market which really changed the workers' leverage. And so in many ways, I think that, do I wish that this had happened at a different time? Yes, because this was a messy period. This was this is not the easiest way to make the case for full employment, because it's happening after the reopening after the pandemic, and then followed by what sort of a global inflationary shock from the war in Ukraine and Russia. And so this just became really messy. But if you kind of sort through that and try to get the signal, it actually, what happens during this time is actually similar to other periods as well. And that includes the late 1990s and also the late 2010s. 2018 and 2019 was finally we actually saw really good wage growth for the first time after like long period of after the Great Recession, unnecessarily so in my opinion. But we actually did see wage growth in the 2018 2019 strongly in the middle and the bottom. But then in this post-pandemic period, we really saw sharp real wage growth at the bottom, in spite of having a high inflation that was no doubt very uncomfortable and painful for people. But I think at the minimum, it highlights that sort of full employment can be a real important antidote to some of the ailments I think that has really, afflicted in some ways our labor market after the 1980s. And one of the reasons is because, we used to spend a lot more time in tight labor markets in the 50s and 60s, especially than we did in the, 80s and 90s, except for, and 2000s. And so I think that going forward, in my mind, it's going to be really important for us to just have that clarity that full employment can be a really important pillar if we're interested in broader based wage growth. And it's not accidental. Actually, wage growth in the last 10 years has been more broad based than in the 40 prior. And it's easy to forget that, because again, it's happening in a environment that's messy. But I think it's important for us to really remember some of those lessons and extract that signal, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to protect gains that actually have been made.
No, and I'll mention Jared Bernstein, who you'd referred to, my co-author, was Biden's chief economist. So it wasn't totally accidental that
That's certainly true. Yes.
he went this direction. But, to carry on that point, going back to the 90s, I remember arguing with people in the mid 90s because, at that time, the conventional view in the profession, I mean, seriously, like these weren't outliers. The conventional view was that we had a full employment rate of 6%. And, you get a little below, you find some people that say maybe 5.8, 5.7, maybe if you're lucky, 5.6, but inflation would take off. And, I obviously disagreed with that view. And, the problem was, how do you show it, and you could try and show this and that, here, this area had lower, but areas, always are different. So it's, so how do you show it? Well, we got the unemployment rate down to 4% in the late 90s, and there was no noticeable uptick in inflation. And, and then again, we got in the late zeros, late teens, 218, 219, again, we got to 4%. We got somewhat below 4%. And again, no noticeable uptick in inflation. And then, again, the recovery period from the pandemic, we got the unemployment rate down to 3.4. There was an uptick in inflation. Again, I don't think particularly that was the low unemployment. Again, I'm not going to say it was zero, but I don't think, we had so many supply chain disruptions. And again, the reason why I'm confident or inclined to say it was mostly supply chain disruptions is you had the same story in Germany and France, even in Japan. So that couldn't be our low unemployment that's causing that.
Yeah. And I think one sort of, to me, a very safe conclusion to draw is that if we're not afflicted by major supply push inflation, supply, and cost push inflation and supply chain disruptions, I think then it's almost certainly the case that every time we have actually let the unemployment rate fall below where we think it, might be the so-called natural rate of unemployment, it's actually been just fine, but it's actually led to broad-based wage growth. So at the minimum, unless there's, maybe if there's some major supply chain disruptions going on, we can have a, sort of discussion of how much stimulus to give, et cetera, right? So that's a and we may still think it's worth doing, but that's a debate I think that, reasonable people could differ on. But, like, for example, if you have a very clear downturn, like we did, major downturn after the financial crisis, not having a sufficiently large stimulus is very clearly, it not only harmed people based on how many people just didn't have jobs, but it really just led to the complete slowdown of when I talk about the job ladder, where people are moving from worse to better jobs, that just stopped completely. And so without that mobility and without people's ability to quit and leave for better jobs, there's very little pressure on employers to actually compete. So if we want to make the labor market look a little more like the textbook, right? If you want the market to actually work, you got to start with a commitment to full employment. Without that, the market is even more, to use this word, monopsonistic that I talk about, where basically, simply put, employers have a lot of leverage and power, and so they don't feel much pressure to have to raise wages. And that's what happened for so many years, and really unnecessarily so. And so I think, like, I don't see full employment as the only panacea or the only thing to do. The book really sort of talks about, variety of other things we need to do, but it's got to be the important starting place, not the least because it makes the market work better. So if you believe in the markets, and if you want markets, well, you want markets to actually function, and this is actually an important part of that.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love to point out with people say, oh, we leave it to the market. Go, well, the market doesn't decide the level of output. I mean, that's, fiscal policy, that's the Fed. That's not the market, and again, we could have differences where we want it to be, but you can't tell us it's the market. That's a policy choice.
Yeah.
Let me get to one last area that, you've written on. I think it's potentially a very important area, and that's industry wage setting. So this is common in a lot of countries in Europe that they have industry wage standards. It's the exception here. There's some, you talk a little bit about this in the book, that there are some breakthroughs. And it's just striking. I'll just mention this. I remember years ago, I was on a panel with an economist from the IMF, and we're doing, this is back when the IMF was telling all the countries they should be more like the United States. We were showing, well, actually, you have countries in Europe that have unemployment rates the same or lower, higher employment rates if you look at prime age workers, 25 to 55, 24 to 55. So why, what's the problem? And I am mentioning industry wage standards, which at that time, I haven't been up to date on the data, at that time are actually associated with somewhat lower unemployment. And he said, well, that leads to wage compression. I said that as a bad thing.
Yeah, right.
Am I hearing you right? And he had an argument. I mean, I think it was wrong, but he said, well, we want the right incentives and, et cetera, et cetera. But anyhow, things have changed.
Yeah, no. So I think, sometimes, when I sort of talk about, well, look, we have the minimum wage, but the minimum wage, it's a very powerful tool for the bottom. And like I said, maybe about the bottom third can be affected, but then that still leaves the middle largely unaffected. Now, maybe if the middle was doing just fine, then that'd be okay. If the median wage was just, growing with overall productivity, for instance, that might lead to thinking like, well, it doesn't, that we don't need to worry about the middle. But that's not true. Productivity has grown, after 1980 by 73% between 1980 and 2019, and the median wage grew by only about 23%. And that's a problem. So the question is, what can you do? Historically, unions played a key role in I think helping raise the middle. The problem today, of course, is that we have maybe a little over 5% private sector union density in the United States, and that is unlikely to change in any time in the near future. So what we can do, as I argue, is like, well, what if we had standards that were not just for the middle? And if that's sort of, like you said, if that sounds like a radical idea, it's actually really not, because in fact, most of our high-income peer countries have some form of that. Of course, a lot of it is through collective bargaining at the sectoral level, and then that gets extended to the rest of the industry. Whether or not you are a unionized worker or union member, if you have a job in a sector that's covered, you're guaranteed to have a certain minimum. Now, you may negotiate a higher wage, but you can't get paid a lower wage. And so what's interesting is there's actually been a good amount of work recently that has really tried to dig into how the sectoral minimum wages and sectoral standards affect the functioning of the labor market. And again, this is where sort of these matched employer-employee data, which by the way are sort of better quality versions, are available in a lot of European countries, and sort of matching that with detailed collective bargaining records that are digitized and looked at. And it sort of turns out that, yes, it compresses wages, and that, put it another way, you reduce inequality. But, the worry is that, well, does that prevent then a high productivity company from attracting, workers, because everyone's paid the same, then you can't change anything? And that answer turns out no. A high productivity companies typically pay higher than the floor, and they get more workers. And so, this kind of reallocation, which you think you want to have in a dynamic market economy, that more productive companies should grow more. So I think most people would agree with that, because that helps the economy do better and potentially raise pay for more people, et cetera. That is, in fact, that does occur. But what doesn't happen is you don't allow really low productivity companies, who really may not even exist if it weren't for the ability to pay extremely low wages. Those type of jobs don't exist, and instead are done by higher productivity companies. And so that reallocation, that productive reallocation, is quite important. In fact, that's the kind of reallocation that happens in a tight labor market, and from minimum wages, that increasing amount of work has shown. And that those sort of productivity reallocations towards better performing companies occurs. And you have some amount of inequality that is basically, some companies being able to pull more workers, et cetera. But you cut off the very bottom tail, meaning you cut off the ability to workers to get exploitatively low wages. That does not occur. So, I wrote about this, doing something along these lines in 2019. Now, the thing is, if I say, well, we need to change labor law, it's like, okay, great. Good luck at the federal level. But here's the thing. We actually don't need to do that. We can do some versions of it. And I looked at the example of Australia. Australia, similar to the United States, also does not have sectoral bargaining, but it has more company by company bargaining at the union level. That's like here in America. But what it has is a sectoral wage standard. So there's like about 1,000 different agreements that sets floors by different jobs, by their sort of a commission at the national level, and that updates these floors every year. And as a result, you get something similar. So I suggested that maybe we should try to experiment at the state level. Again, another thing that when I was writing the book, interestingly, a number of states actually started doing this. So it was exciting to see. It's not many, but for example, we have today Minnesota that has established a commission, a tripartite commission, so employers and unions and state government, that sets wage floors for different types of jobs in nursing homes. In California, there's actually a hospital sector-wide minimum wage that ended up getting negotiated by union workers, and Kaiser Permanente, and then the state legislature actually extended it. So it's sort of like an ad hoc way of doing something that's done more formally in a lot of the European countries. And then even more recently, Washington State, for childcare workers, has established a commission that's likely to lead to sort of setting certain floors. So I think this is important, because I argue that if we're trying to raise pay sort of more towards the middle, and we want to actually make sure that really low wage jobs in these categories are upgraded, then setting a floor, for example, let's say like at 2/3 of the median wage in that job type in an area, that can help push up the standards and also help really kind of build a stronger middle class. there's a lot of unknowns, and I think that this would require experimentation and our learning and willingness to learn, like what works and what doesn't work. But I think it's a really important thing to try, because otherwise we are really not dealing with a really important fact, and that's that middle class is falling behind in this country, and there aren't that many great ideas of how to actually do better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's probably a good spot to end. It's good to have some relative optimism. There are a lot of things hard to be optimistic about in the world today, but the fact that, your work and others have had such a large impact in, many states. Obviously, we're not doing too much in Alabama and Louisiana, but in large parts of the country, it's really made a difference. And what's so encouraging is, as you say, these are experiments. We don't like to experiment with people's lives, but I think, in general, we've seen governors, legislators be responsible. No one just going out and saying we're going to have a $30 minimum wage. I mean, maybe we can aspire to that at some point, but certainly not tomorrow. And it seems with there could be some exceptions where there's been a bad story, but overwhelmingly, they've been successful in improving living standards and not causing any noticeable increase in unemployment. And, that's a great story. We don't have too many great stories we could tell today, but that is a great story. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, it was great to be here. Thanks for having me.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.